Good day to you. And I don't know how much of a chance you've had to travel in this world, but if you have, you've probably noticed there are a lot of differences in media when you go around the world. For example, in Mexico, where I was in the spring, if you get on a public bus, there's likely going to be a television that's playing a cooking show, how to cook some Mexican food. I thought that was a pretty interesting way to spend your time as you're waiting for your bus stop to come up. In Sweden, I can remember filling my car up at a gas station, and out of the blue, an American singer comes on and he says, I'm driving around in my car and I quote, look so fucking good. Yeah, that was in Sweden, an American song playing on the radio, playing profanity like that right out in the open. And so media content differs radically around the world depending on where you go. And that's what this chapter is about that we're taking on today. It's about global media. Chapter 11, we're taking on media and how they differ around the world. And we know that when we look at how media systems grow up in different countries, they don't just grow up without any guidance. Usually there's some sort of philosophy that comes from the culture of the country, which is guiding the way that media are going to be set up. Those philosophies are called theories of the press. There's 4 authors that came up with theories of the press. That's what we're going to be handling now. They are professors, all of them, Siebert, Peterson, and Schramm. Actually, there's 3 authors, sorry. They were all at the University of Illinois in 1956, and they came up with theories of the press to explain how media, that's what that word press is referring to, how media operate around the world. And the first theory that they discussed was called the authoritarian theory. The authoritarian theory is from the 1500s. It's the oldest theory. It's the easiest one to criticize. It's like your parents. You know, your parents decide what's best for you when you're young. They set a curfew for you. They tell you who you can and cannot hang out with. They decide when you're going to be able to get your driver's license. All of these are authoritarian rules, and the punishments are severe if you don't follow them. You may be, for example, grounded, or you may not receive your allowance. That's kind of authoritarianism at the family level, and it's similar to how it operates at a media level. It's the oldest of the theories, and basically the way that it's established is some ruler of a country, usually a military ruler, but sometimes a religious ruler as well, or a king or a queen, some ruler of a country has a direct connection to God, and that person therefore deserves the obedience and the respect of all of the people living in that nation. And that ruler has the best interests of people in mind. That's authoritarian theory, that rulers have a divine inspiration. And that the role of the press or the role of media is just to provide the public with information that is deemed appropriate by the ruler. And so media are servants of the government. However, media are privately owned in an authoritarian culture, so they're not owned by the government. The media are privately owned, and yet they are controlled very, very strongly. You'll find authoritarian theories of the press, you'll find those in countries that are vulnerable, countries that are susceptible to attack from an enemy, or countries that are susceptible to poverty or to disease. And because of that constant threat of collapsing, strong measures are taking place. And in the United States, we have authoritarian dimensions to our law. After 9/11, for example, we passed the Patriot Act, and the Patriot Act makes it permissible for the government to spy on you every time you make a phone call to somebody in another country. So authoritarianism is designed to shore up a country that's vulnerable. Let's move on to the next theory now. This is called communist theory. Communist theory does come from the writings of Karl Marx in the 1800s. And this positions media not just as a servant of the government, like they are for authoritarian philosophy systems. No, in a communist system, the media are actually owned by the government too. And there's only one valid political philosophy in a communist system, and that's communism. There's no valid alternative political parties. You don't have Democrats and Republicans. You only have communism as a valid political system. So a communist government very tightly controls the content that is in a communist media system. The content, in fact, has to be approved by government officials. If you go to China, which has a communist government, they actually have a ministry of propaganda. And that Ministry of Propaganda is making sure that everything that goes out on electronic media meets the standards of the government. It's just impossible to criticize governments in communist media systems. You usually get in trouble. You get disappeared, or you get fined, or you get put in jail. So the press, the media are not a watchdog in a communist system. It's really a supporting apparatus for the party. Now let's move on to the next theory. It's called Libertarian Theory. Libertarian Theory, this is coming up in the 1600s and the 1700s. And this is saying that media should not belong to government, but media should be a separate institution. The media are an institution in and of themselves. And that if you treat people as if they are moral, they are automatically moral, that means that they can distinguish for themselves the difference between falseness and truth. That's what people are left to do in a libertarian society. They're free, right? That's where that word comes from. Libertarian is free. And so in order for people to make good decisions, when they're left to their own free will to make those decisions, they have to be exposed to a lot of ideas. And so it's important to a libertarian theory society that ideas are circulating all the time, and that there's a big marketplace of ideas in order for people to select which ideas are the best. So libertarian assumes that people want to know the truth, and they're guided by knowing the truth. And that the only way that they can get to know the truth is by being exposed freely to ideas. And that different people will have different opinions, that's okay. And that most rational ideas will be accepted through the discussion in the marketplace of ideas. The main weakness to the libertarian theory is it assumes that the intrusion in our lives when it comes to media is likely to come from government. And so libertarian theory does not allow the government to have much of a role in media policy, but libertarian theory does not perceive of profit-making companies as having a detrimental role in our media content. An example is Disney, for example, which owns ABC. Would Disney report that there was an accident with a roller coaster at a Disney World ride? We don't know. We don't know if that'll happen because Disney has a distinct interest not to do that. The stocks will go down, the brand will suffer, etc. So libertarian theory didn't always predict that commercial interests can also have a detrimental effect on media content. Let's go now to the next theory. It's called social responsibility theory. Social responsibility theory comes out of libertarian theory. It comes from a professor, again, his name was Hutchins, and he put out the Hutchins Commission report. And he was concerned, along with others, that media at that time in the 1940s were becoming very cynical. If you were to go to a movie theater and watch a film, a lot of times you would see a cartoon beforehand that said, "Kill a Jap today." So that was a kind of media environment that existed in the 1940s, a very hostile media environment, a very harsh media environment. And so Hutchins and his team decided to put out a social responsibility theory saying that media have a concentrated power in society. So therefore, since they have all this power, they can command millions of people and audiences, they have to have a responsibility to how they behave. They have to hold themselves up to be responsible. They have to provide news to make sure that the political system works. They have to give the public information that the public needs for self-governance. They have to operate as a watchdog of government, catching corruption. The media need to serve economic functions by bringing buyers and sellers together through advertising. Media need to provide entertainment. And media need to be profitable to avoid outside pressures. There's a lot of standards that are being applied there. And the government's role in a social responsibility media system is only as a referee. Like, the government's not going to get involved unless the two sides are not playing fairly. Then it's just like a football game where the government throws a yellow flag and decides to get involved. Now that takes us to our last theory. That's called the developmental theory. And this applies to nations which we previously called third world nations, but we don't want to use that term anymore because third world describes a country that was not associated with the Soviet Union or the United States during the Cold War. That's where third world comes from. a small country that could not afford to align itself with the Soviet Union or the US because it was too small and vulnerable. And so they were referred to as third world nations. They weren't even in the second world, right? So we don't refer to countries that way anymore. It's very condescending. Instead, what we do, we refer to nations that struggle, like a Venezuela or like a Mexico in some cases. We call them developing countries. And those countries have a theory that guide the media in those countries. And the theory is that the government needs media and the media need the government. They need each other. The government's not that strong. The media are not that strong. They need to rely on each other. Government needs media to help promote the things that the government's doing that's good. Need the media to get information out. Media need the government. Media need to have transparency to be able to get to government information so that accurate reporting can go on. Media need funding to get started by the government. Media need training programs for positions from the government. So this is the relationship. It's to help build the country up. Both the government and the media have to rely on each other, and they have different roles in developing each other. I can remember when I was in Ghana, Africa, there was an advertisement targeted towards females to get them to use underarm deodorant. There was no particular brand that was advertised. It was just in the interest of public health. And that funding for that commercial came out from the government. It's part of a developmental media philosophy. Okay, now we're going to go to going global as our next discussion item. It has to do with media standards around the world. And when you look at media around the world, you can learn a lot about those systems. According to Alan Wells, a thinker and researcher in our field, you can know a lot about those systems by asking some basic questions like, who controls the media system in a country? In other words, who regulates it? Is it the government? Is it an agency of government? Is it the military? Is it private enterprise? Who controls the media system? And secondly, who pays the bills? How are media financed? Thirdly, what are the program goals? What are the goals? Is it to get the largest audience possible? Is it to serve the public? Is it to build up the country? Fourthly, what's the target audience? Are they elites, people who are only well-read and cultured, or is it the largest audience possible? Is it specialized audience like gay, lesbian, bisexual, or African Americans, or young people? What's the audience? And finally, what is the feedback mechanism? What means by which do companies get feedback about the media products that they're offering? Is it through polls or ratings or critics? Now that we've asked those questions about standards, we're going to do a little trip around the world. It's almost impossible to get across in a fairly comprehensive way the way that media systems operate around the world, but we can touch on a few areas. We're going to start with Canada. Canada largely has a free press system. It's very similar to the United States, but Canada has some different things going on that make its media system different. First of all, most of the Canadian population lives along the U.S. border. So a lot of Canada is trying to fend off American media programming coming into Canada, coming in and taking over Canadian culture. So Canada actually has laws in place that specify a quota of TV programming has to be Canadian only. Same with music. Only a certain percentage of songs on Canadian radio can be coming from America. Canada's just a vast country. It's the second biggest country in the world. So there's a lot of different territories to cover there to get the signals out. Now let's move on to Western Europe and the United Kingdom. So this is a big area of the world. There's a lot of different countries with a lot of cultures. This area of the world, in terms of its media policy, is heavily influenced by World War II. They're very wary in most governments of Europe about fascism returning. And so media are supposed to be doing good. The media are supposed to be serving the public in most of these countries. And in most European countries, you pay a license fee when you get a TV set. That means you get the TV set and then you pay a fee. And that fee is used to fund television and radio programming. That fee is used instead of collecting advertising money. And so the program does not always have to be the most popular program in the world. to be successful economically because that's where the money comes from advertisers. Instead, the program can just be acclaimed, right? Like the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, that's where the funding goes in Britain. And the BBC produced a documentary that I've seen called Alexander the Great. And this documentary followed Alexander, an actor playing Alexander, as he went across the world. He walked all the way from Britain all the way to Egypt. So to shoot that, I mean, that's very expensive. And what kind of audience is going to be interested in this Alexander the Great? It's not going to be a primetime audience, but it's still worth making that because that's how we learn about history and specifically about Alexander the Great. So the BBC and other European broadcasters, they get license fees. That's how they're funded. No advertising for the public service media. One of the most controversial episodes in European media was the Danish cartoons. You may recall the Danish cartoons. There was an editor of a Danish newspaper, and he decided to publish cartoons that were depicting the Prophet Muhammad in a less than flattering way. And this was fitting into a discussion about immigration that was going on, particularly Muslims coming to Europe. And when he published this, it's offensive to Muslims. You're not supposed to draw Muhammad, period, if you're a Muslim. So this led to widespread protests across Europe, and actually people were killed in Afghanistan, and then a newspaper in France was attacked, and several people were assassinated. So ideas of free speech, in this case religion, vary greatly across the world. Before we leave Europe, let's talk about the European privacy laws. They have some of the strongest privacy laws in the world. The one that I'm referring to is called the General Data Protection Regulation. And this says that companies have to be clear about how their customers' data are being handled, and that online advertising can only target you if you give consent in Europe. And you can ask companies what information they have on you and ask them to delete that information if you want to. And companies have to have clear privacy policies. These are all a matter of law in the European Union. Now let's continue on to other areas of the world. We're going to talk about Central and Latin America now. Most programming, television-wise and radio-wise, and to some extent film, are dominated by Mexico and Brazil. Those are the countries that are putting out the most media content. And Mexico and Brazil have two of the most sophisticated media systems in the world, actually. Most of the countries in Latin America are Spanish-speaking, but you do find Portuguese in Latin America and Brazil. And the most important kind of content that is coming out of Latin America, at least as far as popularity across the rest of the world, is the telenovela. The telenovela, which is that soap opera that is produced in Mexico and Brazil, that goes all over the world. There are places in South American and Central American countries that are very dangerous for journalists to work. That's another mark of the media system. Mexico typically is a dangerous country for reporters, specifically those reporting on drug cartels. Now let's move to Islamic countries and the Middle East. In Islamic countries and the Middle East, media are usually heavily controlled by government. And the media systems are straddling both a social responsibility model and also an authoritarian model. Speaking of dangers to journalists, Syria is typically one of the most dangerous places for journalists to go. The kidnapping and beheadings that have taken place. However, on the good side of things, in terms of a Middle Eastern media system that is doing very well, we have Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera is like the CNN of the Middle East. It originates in a country called Qatar, Qatar, and it's seen as an objective news source. Now let's go on to Africa. Africa is mostly developing country status in Africa when it comes to a media system. You do have some authoritarianism in there as well. Early mass media were brought to Africa, the continent of Africa, by colonial powers, Portugal, Holland, UK, and France. And early coverage only covered white news and white people. But that has been transitioning in Africa for some time now, South Africa leading the way there. And instead, what you have now is a series of countries in Africa that are still very rural. Some of them don't even have written languages. And so to have a newspaper or a web page is just impossible. You only have the oral language, it's only spoken. And it's mostly a developing country situation in Africa. If you get out into rural areas, you have to gain the acceptance of tribal leaders before any changes are going to take place. South Africa has the most developed media system. Now we're moving on to Russia and the former Soviet republics. Just the size of the country makes it almost impossible to develop media on a national basis. The Soviet Union used to cover 1/6 of the entire world. There's 11 time zones in Russia now, and Russia is smaller from when the Soviet Union broke up. Under communism, there was no ideal of an independent press because the purpose of media was just to serve government. And even though you have a country that is reformed and doesn't call itself communist anymore, it still has a strong dose of authoritarianism. Vladimir Putin has a lot of control over media because he can appoint the editors and producers at media organizations. And in some cases, he can have them thrown in jail. And actually, the Russian government has large ownership interests in TV networks, in its own TV networks. So the government has a strong control on media in Russia. Now we're going to move on to Asia. Asia actually speaks to many countries and cultures, and most media in Asia are either government controlled or they are run by public corporations. You can find the development philosophy most common amongst all the philosophies when it comes to Asian countries. The biggest media producers in Asia are India, China, and Japan. In India, you have newspapers that are still really big business. You have state-run television that's given away to private television. India is the largest democracy, but the press is not that free in India. There's a lot of control. Then you have China. In China in the 1970s and 1980s, media were definitely propagandistic. That's all they were, to promote the good things the government's doing in growing crops and achieving water conservation, etc. Now, media are allowed to be somewhat critical of municipal governments, of small governments, not the big Communist Party, but small governments, town governments, so that they can root out corruption. That's allowed in China. In Japan, technology is at the heart of that media landscape. Japan was shaped very much by policy after World War II by the U.S. government. General MacArthur set up the Japan economy. Japan is very much like the United States. It has a mix of private media and public media. And manga cartoons and Pokemon, as we know, have come out of Japan. So this then is going to sum up a little trip around the world as we've taken on just a little bite of global media. Have a great day.